Today, we'll talk about market structure and when to long or short the charts. I'll show you super order blocks, market structure shifts, break-off structures, imbalance, inducement, and premium and discount level trading. Then I'll explain how you can look for best entry points for high profits like a pro trader. We have so much to cover. If you're ready, let's start. Welcome our free trading course, all about price action trading strategies and smart money concepts. Today we'll talk about advanced level trading. If you are looking for a structured table of contents, I set it up for you. You can find it on Google Drive or directly from my website, which is in the description. Okay, let's talk about the market structure and try to make plans about when to long or short. Look at this weekly structure, dollar-yen pair. What do you see here? All of you can see this significant high, right? Which is created by this significant low. And this is our clear weekly market structure break. No question here. I believe any of you can see this. I also put my premium and discount tool here. Always use premium and discount. Much more important than optimal trade entry. At the same time, we have a super order block here. No question about it. Which collides with a nice weekly imbalance. Do you have any questions? I guess everything is crystal clear. Now, where to long or short? How to make decisions based on this chart. Let me close this part and let's assume that we do not know what happened here yet. If I want to short this structure, where should I short it? From the premium and discount, EQ is my first place to search for a short. Then I would be looking for premium areas in a structure to short from. If all fails, then I would be looking for a swing failure pattern above for a sell. However, what should I do at this point from the super order block demand area? Just because I saw a weekly market structure break, should I short it right away? No, I should be looking for long here because in a logical sense, I assume the price will go higher before the short. Use your logic and education. Let's look at this demand area closely and discuss furthermore. Now we are in the daily chart. Let's observe the price further. You can notice this much more precise super order block and daily imbalance. Zooming in to take a closer look at the structure. Notice how the market structure changes right at this point. This creates our daily market structure break upwards. Why made an MSP right here then? Remember the weekly structure. Price 6 weekly premium. The price wants to go higher, especially to this weekly imbalance. Remember, imbalances are liquidity where the price reacts to, where the price is being pulled to. So, what is the gameplay here? The gameplay is so simple. Once you confirm the daily structure shift, you should keep longing until it reaches to the weekly premium. This is your gameplay area. Now we are in the 4 hours chart as you see. Notice this giant imbalance, which is inside the daily discount after the market structure break. You can also notice this simple inducement. Pay attention here. Another structure shift with the 4 hours chart. This is the point of ignition for long. I will fully explain everything on graphics soon. But what happens here is so simple. 4 hour bullish structure shift. 1 day bullish structure shift. Where do all these things happen? It happens right at the weekly and daily super order block demand area. And where is it heading? Yes, to the weekly premium zone. If you watch this video 2-3 times, you will fully understand everything. First times could be complicated and a brain burner, but with time, it will be much more clear. Okay, we are in the 4 hours time frame. Price is ignited and heading towards the weekly premium zone. What exactly happens? Notice this first break of structure, the new push of the price upwards. Here is another secret for you. Sometimes first market structure breaks could be fake. So confirming the first break of structure right after the market structure break will be much safer with less risk. From now on, you can see that the price keeps making new highs. As you can see, it makes a new break of structure one after another, and it keeps heading toward the weekly premium zone. If you are confused, do not worry. In the next section, I'll be explaining again. You will 100% understand it. Okay, back to the daily chart. If your brain survived yet, let me go through everything with a much clearer explanation. This is the structural skeleton of what is happening right here, which I actually tweeted yesterday. Let's explain it step by step. Firstly, market structure happens in weekly time frame. And I'm just putting my premium and discount tool to identify where can I short or long the price. You can notice this giant imbalance in the premium zone. If I want to short the asset, this is it. I will be looking for a market structure break here to sell it. However, the price first needs to go up, but how? Of course, the demand areas, probably the super order block. Should I just long here from the demand blindly? No, I will look for the market structure shift. Once the structure is confirmed, I should be looking for longs with each break of structure. Then you will ask the question, how will you know when to short? I will wait until the structure shifts. There is no guarantee here that the price will go downwards from here. Basically, it can keep going up. I have no idea. And this USD yen pair is an absolutely perfect example of how I trade in the real world. Okay, my 5 trading tips on clear trading. Firstly, where the market structure break happens. It is so important to identify it. Secondly, if the MSP you found is not clear or you have doubts, then what to do? If 5-minute MSP is not good, open 15 minutes. If also that is not clear, then open the 30 minutes. So keep going higher and higher in time frames until you find the most clear structure. Then definitely draw your premium and discount zones. This will help you to identify where the price is cheap or expensive. And look at the price and ask yourself, where is the price heading? Where is the liquidity or imbalance? Next, supply and demand zones. Finding order blocks or breaker blocks are so important. Finally, sometimes the first MSP could be fake and could make another drop and another MSP. Confirming the first break of structure after the MSP will make the trade much safer. Okay folks, ending this great lecture, learned about superior level trading concepts. Probably next week we will look into more trading examples. I hope you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you, please take care and see you soon.